Baik, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Namira Alifa dengan NPM 22351064. Saya dari kelas 5E akan menampilkan video saya sedang memperhatikan materi pertemuan 14.
Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video, I'm going to be teaching you guys every single React hook. If you're familiar with my channel, I'll cover every single hook on this because as you actually use case, check the video part for that hook in the description. But it's pedrotech.co if you're interested in videos. Never enjoyed posting videos as much as I am right now, so I would really appreciate the support that you guys can give me. So obviously, be the use state hook, the most simple hook that you can learn in React. I want to explain a little bit about how I'm going to structure this code base in case you want to just follow the examples by going to the code base in the description. How I structure this is I have this folder over here called hooks, and inside of it, we'll have the example I'm using in the video for each of the individual hooks, also accompanied by any files that I use for the examples. So if you're interested in just checking out the use ID example, you can click on it and go in there. But in our case, we're going to start with the use state hook, and the way this file is structured is obviously just empty in the beginning, but we'll be including them in our app component as we go through the video just to show them on our right over here. So let's get started with the use state hook. So if you are a complete beginner in React, you definitely heard of this hook, but I feel like this tutorial might help you even if you have already used the use state hook multiple times, in the sense that I'll explain to you guys right from the beginning what's the purpose of a state, why you don't directly just get the DOM elements and edit their HTML directly like you would with normal vanilla JavaScript. States are the fundamental building blocks of a React application. Now, the example I want to use for the state here is the most simple example that I believe is used for describing states, which is the idea of building a counter. So in this component over here, I'm going to put a div, which is going to wrap a p tag, so a paragraph tag, which is going to display some number, which is going to be the count. Then we want to have a button over here, which is going to interact with that number by increasing its value. So we'll say increase counter. Now, we currently have no way to store that number for the count, and we have no functions to call when you click the button. Before we create any state, let's just do it how we would normally do with a normal variable, as if you were playing around with JavaScript. I'll create a constant over here. Actually, I'll create a normal variable that can be altered, and I'll say count is equal to 0. And then I'll pass this value over here by passing count. Perfect. You see, now we see the count being 0. On this button over here, I'll create a variable called increase count. And inside of here, we're going to put some logic to increase the count and pass this increase count as the on-click to this button. Perfect. Now, normally speaking, if I want to make this variable go up, right, this value go up by 1 each time, what I could technically do is do count plus or equals 1. But you'll see that this doesn't work. Now, so over here, it should technically, well, because if you were using represent the variable. So this is the idea of a state. A state, in its most simplest form, is just a variable that you can create and change its value. And when its value is changed, it will automatically trigger a re-render of your page to demonstrate the new value. So how do we create one? Well, the way you do it is like this. You say const and then set an open and closing square brackets. Then you set it equal to the use state hook. It should automatically import it from React. Then we open and close parentheses, and you'll see that most hooks will look a similar way. Now, what do you put over here? Well, you put the initial value of what you want your state to be. So in this case, count starts at 0, so we can put 0 over here. But this, you could also pass an empty string if your state represents a string, or even an object if that's the case as well. So we'll keep it at 0. And what do we put inside of here? Well, with the way that the use state hook is defined, and you can look at it if you want to, this should return back inside of here two things. The first is the value of your state, which is being called, you can call it whatever you want, but let's call it count. And then it is a function that you can use to alter the state. So we're going to call this set count. Usually it has this notation, is actually working similar to is you call the set count callback function. And the value over here will be our state with way, and thus making React actually trigger a re-render because it is using the value of a state inside of this component. So you see now, if I keep clicking on this, it will keep increasing. Now, one cool thing that helps you understand more about the React lifecycle is looking at our old console log, this thing over here, right? If we go over here, we see that initially it's supposed to be 0, and we're not console logging initially. We only console log when we click increase count. So we are setting the count to be equal to 1 over here as the first touch of the button, and then we're console logging. So you should assume that when you click this button, we should see 1 because it increases by 1, and then it shows 1. But you'll see that it's always lagged behind. It seems like it will always be 1 behind, even though it's after the set count. And the reason for that is because we're console logging before the page decides to re-render to show the new state value, and thus the state actually only changes value after it's done running this increase count function. So keep that in mind. If you were to do set count over here twice, you'll see what will happen over here. It increases by 2 each time, but it also lags behind on both of them. See? So this is the most basic explanation of the use state hook. It will be the hook that we use for most of our other examples because it's basically the most simplest way of managing the state of application in React. Now, there's other examples that you can play around with, but I think that this should be enough to get you going to the next ones. Okay, everyone. Now let's go into the use effect hook, which is the second most basic hook in React, in my opinion. So I changed a bit the app.jsx that we had before. Instead of showing the state example, I'm showing the effect one. So if you're playing around with the code base, I would ensure that you do the same. So what is the use effect hook? Well, the use effect is one of the most powerful hooks in React, even though it gets a lot of backlash, especially nowadays. And as a beginner, you will mostly use it for doing stuff like fetching data from an API immediately when your page renders. So what the use effect hook does is it lets you run code after the component renders, depending on a set of circumstances. So if I had a state, for example, and I wanted to run a function every time that state changes value, I could use a use effect for that. If I wanted to run a function every time someone goes into my website for the first time or renders this page for the first time, I could use a use effect for that. Now, how is that going to look like? Well, the example I want to give to you guys is the idea of fetching data from an API immediately when you go inside of the website. Now, I'm going to be using a public API that you guys can access. It is the JSON placeholder API. It just returns fake data for users. In this case, we're accessing data for like some posts. So like as if you're in Facebook making some posts. But the idea is that we want to go into our website over here. And when I first render the page, I want to run a function that will fetch this data and display it in my screen. Now, keep in mind, doing this inside of a use effect is one of the methods you're going to be using a use effect for the most as a beginner. But as you grow older in your React journey, you'll see that there's more effective ways of doing this kind of fetching data by using stuff like a React query, which is one of the best methods that you will probably learn later on. But let's get into actually building the use effect to do that. Well, the first thing we need to do is have a way to display that data. So I'm actually just going to display the data of the posts by creating an h1 tag over here, saying posts. And below it, I want to have an unordered list, which we're going to loop through the data that we got back from this API request and display the list items for each individual post, right? So to do that, I want to create the use effect hook. Perfect. You saw it also auto-imported over here. Now, the notation for the use effect hook is very simple. You call the hook, always obviously inside of your component, never inside of an if statement, just like all the other hooks. And inside of here, you put a callback function that will execute whenever your use effect is supposed to. So whatever action information you put over here, like console log page rendered, you'll see that it will actually console log over here. It runs twice because of some of the inner workings of React, where it basically runs twice when you're in development, not actually in production, because of React's strict mode. But you can actually disable that. The whole idea is that it should render once. So what I want inside of this use effect is to be able to fetch some data. But there's one last thing that we have to do to make this use effect work. After this function definition over here, we have to add something else, which is a dependency list. Now, what is the dependency list? Well, like I said, you can make this use effect run every time the page renders, right? But the page may render because of multiple things. It might just render once if there's no states inside of a component like we have over here, and you should see that only displaying once, like I said, right? But if I wanted to run this use effect or this function every time another state changes its value, then I would add that state over here. We'll get to that later on in the video, but there are multiple reasons why you might want to put use effect like data over here. You could want to console log every time a state changes its value, and you could put that state as part of the dependency list. But in the case where we only want to run this once when the page renders, we want to keep it empty like this. Now, what we want to do is we want to fetch data from the API, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say fetch, and I'm going to put the JSON placeholder API link over here, and I'm going to actually use promises in this tutorial. So I'm going to say then I'm going to say, I'm going to grab the response from this .then, and I want to turn that into its JSON format. And then I'm going to put another .then that will convert this into actual data. So I'll grab the JSON, and I want to do something with that data. Right now, let's just console log that data so you guys can see. Actually, I need to do JSON. And perfect. Now you should see that we get the console log over here with all of the data from the API. But how do we display it in our component? Well, we need to use what we learned in the previous hook, which is the useState hook, and utilize a state for this, because we want to have a variable in which when its value is changed, which means whenever we're done fetching data, we want to re-render the page to show its value. So I want to come over here and I want to create one state for the data that we get back from the API. So we'll say data and set data, and inside of this useState, we need to put an initial value. So this will return a list of posts. So the initial value for this will be an empty list. Perfect. Now we need to change this to, instead of just console logging the JSON data, I want to set the data state to be equal to whatever list we get from the API. Perfect. Now to display this list over here, we'll delete this list item and add it back again later, but we'll just loop through this data. And for each item in this data, we want to map its value to some sort of JSX. So we'll grab the value of the post, and in this case, we'll create a list item for each of the items. And inside of this list item, you see it already shows the 100 list items that we got, but we haven't actually displayed any data from them. But inside of here, we'll literally just display the title. So I'll say item.title. Now we know it's title because we can see how the JSON data is formatted. It has a title with the actual title of the post. And the actual data updates to show that information. So this is something that we're doing without having to click any buttons, without having to do any actions. It runs when the page renders for the first time. Now, what about the dependency list that we talked about? Well, the best way I think to explain to you guys about this dependency list is to create another use effect that all I wanted to do is just console log the name Pedro. Now, what will this do? Well, I want to console log the name Pedro every time another state changes. Let's create another state over here. Let's call it something in the lines of show Pedro and set show Pedro. This will be a Boolean. So it will start as false, but it doesn't really matter because all we want to do is whenever I click on a specific button, that will actually create over here on the top as the example for you guys. I want to make a toggle. I want to basically, whenever you click on this button, it will turn this state into the opposite of what it is, right? So if it's true, it will become false. If it's false, it will become true. Because I want to show you guys exactly what this use effect dependency list does. So to do that, we'll just set show Pedro, and we'll do that by setting the value of the set show Pedro equal to the opposite of what it was before. So if it's true, it will become false. If it's false, it will become true. Now let's inspect the element over here. We'll see the console, and we'll see that it did console log the word Pedro a couple of times. In this case, it does twice. Now, why does it does twice? Well, it does on the first render of the page. It does twice on the first render, like we said, but I haven't put a dependency list over here, meaning that every time any state in this component changes its value, it will trigger this use effect. That's why it's important for you to put a dependency list, because if I want this to only render whenever this is the first render, then we put an empty one, and you see now it's only showing twice instead of 4 times. Because previously, it would show twice when this page renders the first time, and then twice again when the data state is updated on this data fetching functionality over here. So what I want to do now is I want to make it such that every time I click on this button, it will trigger this use effect. Now, how can I make this use effect depend on this show Pedro state? Well, the name is already there. I can just put directly this over here, and now every time I click on this, it will trigger that use effect, as you can see over here. Now, this is the basic idea of how a use effect works. you are an advanced person who already have experience and wants to understand this, the most basic idea is that you can use effects to subscribe and clean up from events like connecting to GraphQL subscriptions or connecting to Socket.io, connecting to an event that will consistently happen, maybe even a timeout. And you can then use the use effect to clean up that event. But I won't get into that in this video. I do have a more in-depth tutorial on the use effect if you guys want to check it out. But I think this is all I wanted to cover for this hook. Now let's talk about one of the most important hooks in React, especially when you're starting your journey and you want to learn how to build applications that can actually scale and manage your states, which is the use context hook. Now, to make this example, I actually already built the context example component that we have over here because I want to showcase you guys the use case of the use context hook by first showing you guys an example of what problem it fixes. So imagine we have this scenario over here where we have this parent component, which is called the context example, and inside of it, it calls two child components. So we have one component called child toggle and one component called child display. Now, both of those components do different things. There's a state called is toggle over here, which starts off at false, but depending on its value, it will show this text either off or on. And how we alter that value is by clicking a button that exists inside of the child toggle. And you see, it does update that. Now, you might have noticed that both components utilize this is toggle and set is toggle state over here that exists on the parent component. So to actually access that information, for example, in the child toggle, I need to access the set is toggle function, and on the child display, I need to access the is toggle value. I need to pass that information as part of the props to the child, right? And imagine later on, you might need this information, this state that exists on this parent, on child components inside of this two child components. So imagine I have another component over here that would need this is toggle state, so I have to pass it as prop as well. Now, what this does is it opens your app for someone to access this toggle, but I didn't need this is toggle as part of the component without it of unnecessary trigger render of this component. Every single child of this context example component, well, that's where the use context hook comes in and the intent. But as you learn more and more about React, there are countless others libraries and solutions that you can implement. The most well-known ones are Redux, Zustand, React Query. There's a bunch of them. I have videos on a bunch of them as well if you want to check them out. But I definitely think learning the context API first is definitely the recommended. So how would we make it such that we don't have to pass this information as props? Well, the first thing we want to do is create what is known as a context. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to call it const, and I'll call it the global state context. So I can call it whatever I want, right? Usually you call it depending on the context, but in this case over here, I want to make it such that all the components below this will have access to the state. So I want to make the state be global. So I'm going to call this create context by using the create context function from React. Now I won't pass anything over here. I can pass null if I want to, but this won't matter. What matters is that now I can use this context that I created and wrap it around this whole context example component that I have. I can pass in the global state context and press dot and make a provider out of it. Now a provider is like you're telling React which components you want to provide this global context to. So everything that exists inside of here will have access to the composition of states that you want to put inside of this context. Now how do you put the states inside of here? Well, you pass a value to this provider. In our case over here, we only have one thing that we want to pass, which is both the is toggle value and the set is toggle function. Those are the only two things that we really need. So what I want to create here is an object that will pass these two informations. So I'll pass the is toggle and I'll pass the set is toggle. But if you had multiple states that want to have to be accessed globally, you can also include them inside of this object over here. Now this means that I can just delete both of these props. Because what happens is now, I'll also delete it from here, sorry, and from here as well. Because now, if I want to access both the set is toggle and the is toggle on these two child components, all I have to use is the use context hook, and you will grab values from a context that you provided with. So in the child toggle, I want to grab the set is toggle function. So I'll say const set is equal to use context, and I'll pass the context that I want to put inside of here. So I want to grab states from this context. That means that I can indeed grab the set is toggle directly from this use context. I'll do the exact same thing here with the child display. But instead of grabbing the set is toggle, I'll grab the is toggle. And you'll see that the whole app still works, even though I'm not passing anything through props. Now, this is the beauty of using a state manager, because you're able to create states that you can then use in multiple layers of your components. The example we gave before is the same. If I wanted to access this is toggle on a grandchild component that I create in individual files, so I would have a file for this child toggle, and you would put this on the top. So this is the most basic example, and have solutions like the ones I said, the foundational hooks of React. Those three. It's not the end of the world if you don't actually learn them, especially when I'm talking about the use reducer hook. This is probably one of the most underutilized hooks that I've seen from React, and there's multiple reasons for it. It is technically a hook that should be used instead of the use state hook to manage more complex state logic, like when you have multiple related variables or actions. It does use the same pattern as something like Redux because both of them use the reducer pattern. That's where the name use reducer comes from. And some people live by saying that you need to use a reducer hook if your app grows beyond a simple app. But as you might hear from other people, it is not technically required. I believe just using states can also be a good thing as well. So the best way to explain this is by putting a situation here in the screen in which we are using a use state. So I brought back the example from the counter app that we made, and I made it a little bit more complex by adding the subtraction as well, which was broken. But you can see it's a very simple counter app where I can add and subtract values, and it will appear over here. Now I could technically add as well more things. I could add a multiply, right? I could add a multiply over here and then make the pref multiply, and you'll see that this would also work. Actually, I'll multiply times 2. I'll double. Sorry about that. Yeah, you can see it works as well. So we have those three actions. Now this is all being done with the use state, right? You see the use state over here. How would I do something like this using the use reducer? Because remember what I just said, the use reducer is an alternative to the use state for more complex actions. That's why I added an actual action over here. Well, the most simplest way to do that is, first of all, we'll replace this use state with a use reducer. We'll automatically import over here at the top, and we'll just place it over here. Now the use reducer has the same format as a use state. It will return two things, but the two things that it returns is different from what we have over here, although it has the same logic behind it. Similar to how we grab the count over here, in the use reducer, we'll grab the state, and the state will represent the count. when we create our reducer function. The set count over here, instead of let's call it set count, let's call it dispatch, because we want to follow the reducer pattern, and all of this are part of that pattern. Now, inside of our use reducer over here, we want to pass two things. We want to first pass a reducer function, which we will create in a second, and we also want to pass an initial value for our reducer. So similar to how we had it before the count equal to 0 over here, we want to pass an initial value for this reducer. A reducer will be in the format of an object. So we'll pass an object with a count inside of it and an initial value of 0. Now, we want to create what is known as the reducer function, this thing over here. And we'll create it over here. So we'll say const reducer, and we'll pass in a function which will contain two things, a state and an action. Now, a state is just a placeholder value for the current state of your reducer. So in our case, we only have one piece of state in this reducer, which is our count. So if we want to access the current value of the count inside of this function, we can do state.count at any time. Now, what is the action? Well, when you want to change this state in any part of it, you can dispatch actions, and those actions should be handled inside this function. So for example, over here in our set count over here, instead of calling set count, we'll just dispatch an action and we'll give it a type. For example, in this case, it's the increment action because we're incrementing. So we're not actually handling the logic of increasing or decreasing or doing anything inside of this. We're going to do all of that inside of this reducer function. And if I want to subtract, I can do the exact same thing, but by calling a dispatch of type decrement. And I'll do the same thing for double over here. We'll call it double. Now, where will we handle this? Well, we'll handle it over here, and we'll probably use a switch to check all of the action types that exist. So it's actually action type. So we'll come over here, we'll pass in the switch statement, and we'll check for all the cases. When the reducer function is called, we'll check for the case of the increment action. And if that's the case, we want to return what the value of the state is going to be like when this action is dispatched. So remember, the reducer state looks like this. It's an object containing all the states that you want to have inside of this reducer. In our case, we only have one, which is the count. So if I want to make this increment action increase this count by 1, what I can do is say count is equal to state.count, because we'll get the next two cases. I'll actually just copy this and paste it. We'll just change this to -1, and on the double, we'll just multiply replace this count over here. If I want to access the count value, and just say state.count. And we should see that this does work. It's the same thing as we had before, but if we're more familiar with what's for a user. And directly inside of this single function, and then to just dispatch those actions over here. It might simplify everything. But one single case that I want to put before we leave is you do want to handle the case in which you accidentally dispatch something that doesn't exist, right? If I were to put a name over here that doesn't exist, I think this will break. Yeah, you'll see it breaks. So we want to put a default case over here. And in this case, let's just console log no reducer type. No, not action type. Now, what happens is, even though that name is over here, we should see that console log happening. And you can obviously throw errors, you can do whatever you want to handle that case. It doesn't really matter. I just wanted to add it because you don't have a switch case without a default to. So this is the basic idea of the use reducer hook. Okay, now we're going to talk about the use ref hook. And the use ref hook is one of the coolest hooks in my opinion because they're almost like I almost never use it. And when I use it, it solves exactly the issue I'm trying to solve. And I love it for that. Now you can use refs technically a lot in React if you personally want to. But its main purpose and use case is that the use ref kind of acts like a little box that can store a value. And this value will stay the same even if the component it was created in re-renders. So it is often used, and you'll see it being used for two different things. The first one is accessing the DOM elements directly if you ever need to, and we'll get to an example of that. And the second one is keeping immutable value. So you can technically use the useRef hook to store values of previous of states, but like store the previous values of states, even though it will change due to a render. So the ref won't trigger a render when it's changed. So we'll see both of those. It's one of the ones where it takes a while for you to get used to it, but it is great to be used, especially when you want to hold values inside of your React application, but you don't want to display those values in your UI. So if you ever have a variable that you want to keep information of, but you don't want its value to change, but you want to display in the UI, meaning you don't want its value change to affect the re-render of your component, you could use the useRef hook. So let's start with the first example, which is accessing DOM elements directly, because that one is one of the coolest ones. So the first thing is if you have an input, and we'll return here just an input with a text, like a type of text. So type text. We should see that input over here, right? Now, if I want to get the current value of this input without using the useState hook, because if you are familiar with states and inputs, you should know that you can indeed keep track of whatever is typed on an input by just changing a state to whatever the value of the input is. But if you want to use a useRef for this, you can do it like this. You can create a reference to this input, let's call it input ref, and then set it equal to the useRef hook. Now, this useRef hook will allow us to make a direct reference to an HTML element. In this case, it will be the input. So we can come over here and set this as a reference by passing in a ref property and then setting it equal to our input ref. Now, if I want, I can create here a button that, let's call it on click. I'll create a function that all it does is just console logs the current value of the input whenever we call this function. To do that, I'll create over here a button right next to this input. So we'll create the button and we'll call it console log. Sorry about that, console log. And we'll pass in this on click to this button. So on current text written on the input. A dot current calls a
AI is changing the game for app development. Firebase is here to help. We offer a platform designed to support you throughout your app and business's journey.
And you'll see that when I click console log now, it should actually, that is input. Whenever I click on this button, I can just say focus. And this is a function that exists in JavaScript. When I click on this, it should focus on this input, as you can see, and I can start typing. So this is the most common example of a useRef. But if you remember, I just said that if I change a value inside of this input ref, it won't trigger a render. For example, if I wanted to change the input ref.current.value, right, which we know represents what is currently typed on this input, I want to change it to the word Pedro. You should see that when I click console log, which right now shouldn't even say that, but when I click this, it will change this thing to actually say Pedro. But if I were to create a use effect over here, right? Remember the use effect? If I were to create a use effect that updates and it will trigger this function. Well, we're not going to put a dependency list. It will trigger this function every time the page re-renders. And we console log the text page re-rendered. You should see that obviously it console logs initially. Then I'll type this once and I'll change it to page row. Even though the UI changed in a way, it didn't trigger a re-render. If you were using a state for this, it would definitely trigger one. So this is the main two use cases of a ref. Another use case is keeping count of the previous state of a state, so the previous value of a state. So I'm going to show you guys what this means. So let's create a state here and use the example that we've been using throughout this whole tutorial. We'll create a count, so a counter state. We'll start at 0, and we'll call it count and set count. Now let's change this to have a p tag that will display that count, and we'll say just straight up count. And then we'll have this button, which, like before, we'll just call a set count function to increase. So we'll say prev is equal to prev plus 1. And we'll change the name. I'll close this, and we'll change the name of the button to increase or increment. Perfect. So we have this counter example. We've been dealing with this for this whole tutorial, right? Now, what if I want to constantly keep track of the previous value of the count? So whenever count is 11, I want to keep track of what the value of the state was before. Obviously, because of the nature of this specific example, meaning to get to 11, the previous value had to be 10, it's kind of redundant. But states that can have multiple variations of its values, this could be very useful. Now, if I wanted to do that, what I can do is, first of all, set up a use effect that will be called every time the count changes. And we can do that by passing the count to its dependency list. Is equal to use ref. Actually put a label to this. We'll say into this, add stuff to it. It wasn't a number or a string, but now it is a number because we set it to be. We didn't pass this as a reference to a DOM element. We're using it as an actual variable. Now, when you click increment, you'll see that the count goes up, but the previous count doesn't because we're not doing anything with it. What we want to do is make it such that whenever the count changes, we want to set the previous count equal, previous count of current equal to the current count. So you'll see that it will always be equal to the previous version of the count state. So it's a good way for you to remediate how your states are changing and understanding how your app is working without actually causing issues like re-rendering. The best analogy I've heard for the useRef hook is that it's like a sticky note that you can attach to a DOM element or a variable, and you can read and write it, but it doesn't really affect the rest of your component's behavior unless you explicitly use it. So it's one of the most important hooks in React, in my opinion, one of the most underused hooks as well. But at the same time, you start understanding it the more you run into situations in which you need to use it. Okay, everyone. Now let's talk about the use imperative handle hook. It's probably the hook that you'll use the least by far out of all the hooks. If you watch my previous React hooks course, I also mentioned this. I gave one use case for that, and I believe that's the only use case I ever ran into where I needed to do this, especially because the main pitfall of refs and the use imperative handle hook as a whole is that you shouldn't be overusing refs in your projects. So the use imperative handle hook is only used whenever you are using refs and in a specific use case to it. So it's the kind of thing where, to be honest, if you want to skip this part of the video, feel free to do so. I even want to go through it fast because I don't think it's actually explaining by typing everything will probably give a worse explanation. So I already built up an example over here of how the use imperative hook can work, and I also wrote some comments so that you guys who are just looking at the text can actually understand everything as well. So the use imperative handle hook works by basically allowing you to customize the ref you decide to expose to a parent component. And so in the best, and you can do this. In our parent, I want to have buttons that directly interact with a ref that exists in one of its childs. Now, in this example, we have two buttons, right? We have a button to focus on an input and a button to clear an input, and they both work, as you can see. But one thing you might have noticed is that both of the buttons exist on the parent, but the input and the ref that represents the input exist on the child. So how exactly do we do this? Well, normally, if you want to be able to access this, you create the ref over here on the parent component. So we called it the input ref. We used a use ref for it, and we passed it as a ref to our child component. When I create this child component, we have to use something called a forward ref, which I import over here on the top, and it basically allows you to expose a DOM node or a reference to the parent component. So it's exactly what we want here. We want to have access to some sort of DOM element that exists in this child in our parent. So it's a very specific use case. So we use a forward ref for that, and we can still obviously access the props like this was a normal component. I know it looks a bit different because we have a function wrapping around all of this, but it now allows us to have access to that ref, which we then pass into our use imperative handle hook. All of the functions that we want to allow in the child. We only want to expose the two things that we want to call in the parent, which in this case is the focus input and the clear input functionality. So what we do is we create functions for both of those functionalities, like the one we did over here and the one we did over here. And with the use imperative handle hook, what this will assure is that the ref that we have over here, that we then passed here, will now have, instead of its current object, it will have those two properties, those two functions. So now my app completely works, and it does everything by using the use imperative handle hook. Now, why would you use the use imperative handle? Well, it's mostly about control. So instead of exposing your entire child component, you might want to only expose a specific functionality. Like in this case, we're just exposing those two methods, the focus input and the clear input. But also the whole idea of encapsulation, which can make your project more organized. It basically keeps the internal workings of the child component hidden while letting the parent interact with it in a controlled way. Now, if you're a beginner and you're watching this, like I said, you'll rarely need to use this hook. But it's very handy when you're building stuff like reusable components that need to have controlled interactions between the parent and the child. Okay, everyone. Now we go into another rarely used hook. And similar to the previous one, the use imperative handle hook, I already have the example set up over here. However, I will go over each of them because I feel like it would just be a waste of time to actually type everything out when I feel like the explanation would be better if everything's already set up. So what is the use layout effect? Its name is very similar to the use effect, but there's a layout in the middle. So what exactly is it? Well, think of a use effect, but for way less use cases. That's what the use layout effect actually is. It's basically a version of the use effect that will execute before the browser repaints the screen. So it will execute and run synchronously after all of the DOM mutations that occur, but before all of that UI is painted into the screen of the user. So this means that this use layout effect hook is very useful for tasks that you need to measure or manipulate the DOM immediately after changes, ensuring that the DOM is in its box, which we would basically, so this just said reset. So if I change this to 80%, like 82 pixels, right? Now, why or second? It didn't actually re-render automatically. So we created using a ref. So technically, for a brief second, if you refresh this and it's rendering for the first time, if we're using use effect, it wouldn't have the information accurately for the box width until this red, and then it set the correct information. So this is all that the use layout effect does. It just runs before the use effect. It runs in that small gap between the DOM existing and having its changes and the UI being painted into the screen. Now, it is good, like I said, for doing stuff like getting sizes or positions for a DOM element, and it's good as well for synchronous DOM updates when you specifically need to update a DOM element and avoid flickering or incorrect measurements. So in this example, if we're using the use effect instead of the use layout effect, this would have to run twice because the page would have to render twice because the use effect would render first without this action, and then it would trigger the set box width because it would get the information, and then we would render again. It would cause a little flicker that we saw. We don't see it anymore because everything is very stable. But if I were to change this, maybe let's put it to 90 again. Yeah, we didn't see it, but imagine in a larger scale project, you should see it. And the use layout effect allows you to have access to that specific part of your component lifecycle. Now, you might be asking, why not always use the use layout effect? Won't there be thousands of situations in which you might want to be doing your changes before you paint to the screen? Well, the official React documentation recommends against it. Basically, says that it blocks the browser from painting until it finishes, which can hurt the performance of your application if it's overused. So they specifically recommend that you use the use effect for all other tasks and only use the use layout effect when you need exactly the use case that I mentioned in this example. So if you're a beginner and you're looking to use the use effect for stuff like data fetching, logging, you really don't need synchronous execution, then if that's the case, just stick to the use effect. But if you want to deal with positioning and DOM element widths and sizes, use the use layout effect. Okay, everyone, I'm going to talk very briefly about the next hook that we have over here, the use insertion effect hook. The reason for it is because even the React documentation only recommends you to use this hook if you are an author of a CSS and JS library, meaning that if you are an author of a library that uses CSS styles and deals with all of that, then this would help you massively. But if you're a normal React user who don't do that, you'll probably be better off using other alternatives, like, for example, the previous hook that we talked about, the use layout effect, and the use effect hook. Now, why am I even including it? Well, because this is a full course. It's an updated course on my previous course, which I did around 3 or 4 years ago, and I want to include everything, including things that I don't think you guys technically need to use, but if you guys are interested in going to this timestamp of the video and watching this, feel free to do so as well. So what is the insertion effect hook? So the use insertion effect hook is basically, like I said, specialized hook that runs synchronously during the rendering process, but differently from the use layout effect hook, it runs just before the mutations are made to the DOM. So it is designed for cases where you need to insert styles, meaning CSS styles or style tags, like we have in this component over here, into the DOM during rendering to ensure that they're actually applied immediately. So you can see that you'll probably never run into a situation where you need to do something like this, and you will much better off using the other alternatives. But as specified by the React creators, this is primarily intended for CSS and JS libraries, like style components, one that I personally used a lot in the past. And the reason why they benefit from using this is because they're able to inject critical styles into the DOM before the browser even attempts to paint the UI. So this will avoid situations where a component briefly renders, but without any of the styles, and then it flickers to the component with the styles. So it's similar to the use layout effect in the sense that it will prevent those flickers, but this is specifically talking about styles. So I'm not going to go too much in detail with this example over here, but we see that we have here a div, and in this example, we're using the use insertion effect hook to style this div, which basically just means setting a color for the text and call it, like setting a background color to blue. But we're doing all of this at a different stage from where we would if we were to just come over here and add a style tag, because we're doing this before the DOM mutations happen. And like I said, this can be very beneficial in some cases. Obviously, we aren't seeing the benefits over here, but you're able to see a specific use case of it. It's very similar to a use effect hook. And obviously, in this case over here, we're creating a style document element and appending it to a specific part of our document. And this use insertion effect will run during the rendering phase, which, like I said, will ensure this not to flicker. And when the component unmounts, which is the return, similar to a use effect cleanup method, it will clean up all the insertion of React supported use case. So if hook and React, but I generates a unique and stable you want to have your app be very accessible to everyone. So you use something like you create an ID for an input and you link a label to that input. And this is very common by doing something like this, where you set an ID to an input and then you set an HTML4 to a label that links to this input. In this case over here, we have a name label and the specific input that would take the value for the name, right? Now, what does the use ID hook help us with? Well, by server-side rendering apps like Next.js and this hook that they provided with works seamlessly. It provides this ability to ensure consistency and stability across the renders of your components, and it will prevent any type of ID collision. HTML4, obviously they're the same, so it's really of the use ID hook, and this should give me a unique ID that I can use to set my labels and inputs. So I'll put over here ID for this one, and I'll put ID for this one, and we should see that now when we refresh this, the ID is a unique one. So it says R1 over here. Now if I were to have another input and another label, for example, I could have another one over here, and I can just generate another ID and call it something like ID2, and then put the same variables over here. You should see that they do have different values, and also they are unique, right? So they generate different values at every time you render this. But since you're using the same variable, you don't have to handle all the uniqueness. It will do it all for you. Now there are a couple things that I would say are best practices. For example, I'd say use the use ID mostly for labels and inputs, but also for just dynamic elements, like whenever you have a section that might collapse into other elements, or specifically if you want to keep track of different tabs in your website, you might want to use the use ID as well. And also one mistake I see a lot of people doing is when you're inside of a map, where like you're mapping through a list and you're displaying items, and you want to put a key, right? The key property. A lot of people want to just put the ID, but no, use the index or the ID of the key of the mapping function to keep track of those elements. Don't use this use ID. It goes against the purpose of this hook. And if you are a beginner watching this, just see it like this. The use ID is like a handy name tag maker. That's the best analogy I've seen so far. It just makes it such that each component gets a unique tag, which is the ID, and it makes it really easy to identify and link the elements without worrying about duplicates or conflicts. Now, let's talk a little bit about the use transition hook, which is one of the coolest new hooks that React has to offer. Now, the use transition hook is mainly used in React when you're dealing with a situation in which you need to handle non-urgent updates. That means that if you want to prioritize some sort of update to your component, that your app is more important updates. For example, we're going to be doing this in this component over here of hard calculation. So generate automatically over here. This list has 10,000 items, and all of the items in the list are basically just the word item and then the number of the item. So what we do here is, as we type on the list, we're able to filter for the specific items that we're writing, right? So for example, if I put one over here, there's only one item with this because there's 10,000 items. But it will automatically filter everything, but it does feel a little bit like not smooth because as I'm typing this and as this list grows, it will indeed need more time to calculate stuff. For example, if I were to put another 0 over here and I were to continue typing this, it's still smooth, but if I were to add more and more, right, this would get pretty tough. It can even break, as you can see. It just broke my app. Let me go back. But yeah, calculations do get expensive, especially when you to your memory. So the thing is, whenever it's loading a calculation, you want to show the user some sort of immediate update to notify them that something is happening, like for example, showing a loading spinner whilst you do the calculations. So you're basically prioritizing an update transition hook. So what do we do in this case? Well, is the transition pending? I'll just say, okay, is the transition, know what transition is in all of this information as a callback function. It's done, it will set the is pending to false. Or it was ready. But in this case, it'll show a loading screen and it will continuously show whenever it requires time to load stuff, which at the end it doesn't require that much. But in the first time you type item, it does require because it's looking through everything. Right? So this is the basic example of why you might want to use the transition hook. I use it a good amount. It keeps interactions with the users pretty smooth. It avoids UI freezing during like expensive updates. And it overall just improves the user experience because it shows loading states when usually previously I couldn't show loading states, or at least I didn't used to, because I obviously use loading states when I'm fetching data from an API. But with something like this where I'm filtering data and doing everything on my code, I don't really have alternatives other than this, or I didn't used to. So I do think it's great, especially for situations like filtering, which is the most common use case I've seen. Now, if you're a beginner and you're watching this, I would say that the easiest analogy to understand the use transition hook is that it allows you to
3 tanda anak Anda memiliki kemampuan pemrograman. Pertama, anak terus-menerus main games, misalnya
put less attention to the important work, which is in this case filtering what they're seeing. They're seeing improving performance, similar to the previous, because I feel like it will help explain the difference between them. But in its core, they use deferred value hook. Deferred value meaning that it might cause during the it doesn't require any. It is very similar to something like a debounce that you might be used to if you're, I don't know, writing search queries that searches or fetches data from API based on what someone is typing on an input. But it has some differences because in this case, we're not delaying the execution of the filtering or the API request. What we're doing is just deferring the value update to reduce the cost of rendering that information. So how exactly would we implement it here to make something similar to what we did with the use transition hook? Well, what we would do is we would say use deferred value over here in the top, and then we obviously have right here an input and we have a query variable, right? That it represents what we're searching here. So we'll put 2, 3. This goes to the query state, and then we have this items list is the same one as before, and then we filter the list. Now, what I want to do is variable here to basically check to see if this item is included. I'll set it equal to the use deferred value hook and pass in the query. Already, we have the query version of the query, the one that is waiting to be done. We can show a loading screen. So we'll say p-tag and then loading. And again, this is crucial for when you're dealing with complex operations that would benefit from reducing the cost of rendering. And it's mostly with like something like typing fast, like I'm trying to do right here. But it will actually not make you run into issues where it's taking a lot of time to filter through that list. Now, you might still be wondering, how is this different from the use transition hook? Well, it differs in what it does, when to use, and how it works. Because what it does is it defers a value from propagating immediately, when the use transition hook, on the other hand, defers the state to update or render input. And it just happens that the example I used for the use transition, whenever your transition hook, I think that means because that's definitely something. To explain this hook, I made this example component over here, which is a very simple component that just fetches data from the Pokemon about what this hook is. Custom state managers, it ensures consistent during update. What it actually looks like, but we'll create a variable called state and set it equal to the use sync external store. And then this hook, you need to pass technically 2 things, but you can also optionally add a 3rd thing. The 3 things you need to add is first a subscribe function. So we'll have to create that, which will register a listener for any external state changes. Then you also pass in a get snapshot function, which will also create, which its main purpose is to return the current state of a store. And then there's also the optional thing that you can pass here, which is a function called get. So what I do is create a custom store that will fetch things that you can create a synchronized folder, and I'll call it snapshot. Since I'm not using server-side, something like this piece of information, one property called Pokemons, and it will be an array. And we'll call this the initial state. Then we'll have some listeners, which will also be a list because it will be the list of our subscribers. Then we're going to have a function over here that is going to fetch the data and update the state. So inside of here, we're going to logic. So one thing you might have after we get the data, results through each of the like this. And then store, and we'll grab each listener. React will automatically set this callback function to have this listener function, which we can then call. So React does this for us. And then this will notify all of the subscribers. And then down here, we're going to just create a variable called the get state. It's a getter for this state, the state of our store. And we'll also have to create a subscribe function. So I'll say subscribe is equal to listener, because this will be passed by the usesync's external store hook as well. And inside of here, we'll grab the listeners array. So if I want to subscribe a component to this, I'll just grab that array and push the listener that we're connecting through the hook. And then when we finish this, we also want to clean this up and return back function where I said listeners is equal to listeners.filter. And we'll just filter out if the listener is already there. So I'll say L is not equal to listener. So just some logic to keep it. I know it's a bit confusing. I recognize that, but this is a very common pattern that you might see when creating a store like this. And it makes a very easy subscribe function. The state, we don't even need a state. Fetch the Pokemons. Just have a normal use effect that will call it handles everything for us. Now the great thing having to write all of this logic ensures their structure when you get used to it. Now, one thing you might be questioning yourself is, why didn't we just do all this logic inside of a context and then use the useContext hook to grab that data? Well, there's a couple things that differ between doing that and using the useSync external store. I think it mainly differs on purpose, performance, and reactivity. So talking about the purpose, the useSync external store, like I said, the purpose of it is just syncing React components with some sort of external store. Whilst the useContext hook and creating a context, its main purpose is something else. It's sharing state and data across a component tree. Now, you can indeed do something similar using either of those, but where it becomes very different is the performance, because with the useSync external store, it's specific when the context value will change, which in some cases might cause performance issues. Now, the last thing triggers updates for all of its sharing, static, or infrequently changing. But in this case over here, everyone for watching this video, this was a lot of